said I was lucky to still have a family after everything fell apart. I believed them, for a while. My name is Lorelei. I was 31 years old when my husband died, and 31 years old when my parents told me, in the same breath they used to offer condolences, that I needed to get back on my feet and stop being a weight on everyone around me. The funeral flowers hadn't even wilted yet. Owen had been sick for 14 months. I know that because I counted every single one of them. I kept a small notebook on the nightstand, not for anything sentimental, just practical things. Medication times, doctors' names, insurance claim numbers. When you spend over a year navigating hospital billing departments and insurance appeals and pharmacy prior authorizations, you stop being a wife and start being a case manager. I got very good at it. I got very good at a lot of things I never wanted to be good at. Owen died on a Tuesday morning in March. He was 34. I had taken a leave of absence from my position at the county health department 18 months before that to care for him full-time. We had savings. We had his life insurance. We had a plan the way people who love each other make plans, quietly in the dark, when one of them knows they're running out of time. What we didn't have was anyone watching my sister. But I didn't know that yet. 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother called. Not to check on me. She called to tell me that my sister Dara had found something. An opportunity, she said, her voice bright in a way that made my stomach tighten. A wealthy man, a retired orthopedic surgeon turned real estate developer, needed a live-in personal assistant. Someone to manage his household, his calendar, his correspondence. He'd had a minor stroke the previous fall and his adult children lived across the country and weren't coming back anytime soon. The pay was generous, my mother said. The house was in Westport, Connecticut. I would have my own suite. I told her I wasn't interested. She told me I didn't have a choice. Those weren't her exact words. Her exact words were something about how I'd been out of work for almost 2 years, how the life insurance wouldn't last forever, how it wasn't healthy to sit in that apartment alone, how Dara had already given the month's family coordinator my name and resume, how it would be rude to back out now. I said, "You gave my resume to someone without asking me?" She said, "We're trying to help you, Lorelei." My father got on the phone and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I had heard that my whole life. Don't make this harder. Don't ask questions. Don't remind us that what you want matters. I went. Not because they told me to. I want to be clear about that. I went because I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and because a part of me thought that movement, any movement, might feel better than sitting in the apartment where Owen had died and waiting for something to change. I also went because I needed the money, and I wasn't too proud to know it. His name was Dr. Hargrove, Richard Hargrove. He was 68, silver-haired, thinner than his photographs suggested, with sharp, dark eyes that tracked everything in a room without appearing to. He had built his company from one medical practice into a real estate portfolio worth somewhere north of $300 million, if the Connecticut business journals were to be believed. He lived alone in a house that had 11 rooms, a detached garage, a rose garden that his late wife had planted, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Fenn who came Tuesdays and Fridays and regarded me, when I arrived, with the particular suspicion reserved for people who might be trying to take something. Dr. Hargrove met me at the door himself. He didn't shake my hand immediately. He looked at me for a moment, not unkindly, just assessing. And then he said, "You're younger than I expected." I said, "I've been told that." He stepped aside and let me in. The house was quiet in the way that expensive houses are quiet, a stillness that felt maintained rather than natural. He walked me through the main floor himself, slowly because his left side was still slightly uncooperative from the stroke, and he narrated as he went the filing system in the study, the medication schedule on the refrigerator, the contact list for his attorney, his accountant, his cardiologist, the property managers for the commercial buildings. He was precise. He didn't repeat himself. He expected me to keep up, and I did. At the end of the tour, he sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for me to do the same. He slid a folder across the surface toward me. "Your terms," he said. "Review them. If anything needs adjusting, tell me." I opened the folder. The monthly salary was more than I had made annually at the health department. I kept my face neutral. I was good at that too by then. "The position isn't charity," he said, reading my expression anyway. "I need someone competent. The last two people my children sent me couldn't figure out the online banking portal, and one of them reorganized my files alphabetically by first name." He paused. "I have a system. I need someone who respects systems." "I respect systems," I said. "Your resume says you managed federal grant compliance for a regional health department." "Yes." "That's not nothing." "No," I said. "It's not." He studied me for another moment. Then he said, "There's one more thing. I'd like to know why you're here, not the circumstance. Your agency contact told me about your husband. I'm sorry for that, genuinely. I mean, why you said yes. I thought about lying. I thought about saying something polished about wanting a fresh start or valuing the opportunity. Instead, I said because my family arranged it without asking me, and I was too tired to argue, and I needed the income." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "At least that's honest," and stood up, and the interview was over. I moved in on a Saturday. The work was not difficult. It was detailed and relentless, and it required the kind of sustained attention that leaves you too occupied to think about anything else, which was, I realized after the first 2 weeks, probably why I had agreed to it. Managing Dr. Hargrove's affairs was like managing a small company. The commercial properties alone generated a constant stream of correspondence. Tenant issues, maintenance contracts, insurance renewals, property tax appeals. He had 3 ongoing legal matters, one of which was a boundary dispute with a neighboring landowner that had been running for 6 years. He had a quarterly board meeting for a non-profit hospital foundation he'd helped establish. He had a brother in Phoenix he called every Sunday evening, and a daughter in Seattle he called less frequently, and a son in Boston who called him only when he needed something. I got very good at knowing which calls to put through immediately and which ones to let go to voicemail. He was not an easy man. He was demanding and occasionally curt, and he had no patience for vagueness. But he was also, in a way I hadn't expected, fair. When I made a mistake in his accounting software in my 3rd week, transposed 2 digits in a wire transfer, caught it before it processed, I told him immediately. He looked at the correction I'd already prepared, then looked at me and said, "Good catch," and that was the end of it. No lecture, no threat, just acknowledgement and forward motion. I started to understand why his late wife had stayed married to him for 39 years. I had been there for about 6 weeks when the folder arrived. It came in the regular mail, a standard white envelope addressed to me personally, care of Dr. Arthur Hargrove's address, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 lines typed on it. "Your sister has been collecting your husband's VA survivor benefits since before he died." I read it twice, then I set it flat on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. Owen had served 8 years in the Navy before a knee injury ended his active duty. He was honorably discharged. He received a modest monthly disability payment through the VA, which we had used for his medication co-pays. When he died, I had filed the paperwork for survivor benefits, a process that had taken 4 months and 3 appeals and more phone calls than I could count. The VA had told me the claim was still under review. That had been 7 months ago. I picked up the phone and I didn't call my sister. I called the VA regional office and I sat on hold for 43 minutes, and when someone finally answered, I gave them Owen's social security number and my own, and I asked about the status of the survivor benefit claim. The woman on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, that account shows benefits have been dispersed monthly for the last 8 months to a direct deposit account." What account? I said. She read me the last 4 digits. They weren't mine. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was standing in Dr. Moment. Hargrove's kitchen with the sun coming through the window over the sink and a pot of coffee I'd made 20 minutes ago going cold on the counter. And I was doing the math in my head. 8 months, the monthly amount, and the number I arrived at sat in my chest like something swallowed wrong. I need to know, I said carefully, how to report a fraudulent beneficiary claim. She told me. I wrote down every word. I hung up and I stood there for another minute. Then I went to Dr. Hargrove's study, because I had a full afternoon of work to get through, and I sat down and I did it. I didn't call my sister, I didn't call my parents. I made an appointment with a veterans benefits attorney in Bridgeport for the following Thursday, and I filed an initial fraud report with the VA Office of Inspector General online that same evening, and I did not tell anyone I had done either of those things. I want to say I felt righteous in those moments. I didn't. I mostly felt tired and cold and like I was watching myself from a slight distance, a woman alone in a borrowed house, filling out forms about her dead husband's money, which her sister had been stealing. The attorney's name was Mr. Rondeau Adesanya, and he was thorough and precise, and he did not seem particularly surprised by my situation, which told me something about how common it was. He told me that what Dara had done was federal benefits fraud, that the penalties were serious, that I had a strong case, especially given the direct deposit discrepancy and the timeline. He told me to gather everything, Owen's discharge papers, the original benefits notification, every piece of correspondence I had from the VA. I had all of it. I had kept everything in a binder, labeled by date, because I was the kind of person who kept things in binders, because Owen had depended on me to be that person. I went back to Westport and I kept working. 2 more weeks passed. I found out the rest of it from my mother, accidentally. She called on a Wednesday evening to ask if I was settling in, which was the closest she came to asking how I was, and in the course of the call, the way things slip out when people aren't careful, she mentioned that Dara had put a down payment on a condo in Scottsdale. She mentioned it the way you mention good news, warmly, as a thing to be happy about. I said, "Where did Dara get money for a down payment?" My mother paused. "She's been saving." "Saving from what?" I said. "She hasn't held a full-time job in 3 years." Another pause. Longer. "She found a way to manage," my mother said. I didn't push it. I said goodbye and hung up and sat with what I now understood. The condo in Scottsdale. That was Owen's money. 8 months of survivor benefits meant somewhere between $11,000 and $15,000, depending on the disability rating, and she had used it to put a down payment on a condo in Scottsdale, Arizona. While I was filing appeals and living in a stranger's house and eating microwave soup because I was trying not to spend money I didn't have. I called Mr. Adesanya the next morning and told him about the condo. He said, "That's going to be relevant?" I said, "I know. Here is what I did not do. I did not call Dara. I did not call my parents. I did not post anything on social media. I did not tell anyone at all, except my attorney and eventually Dr. Hargrove. I told him because he noticed something was wrong and he asked me directly, and by that point I had been in his house for 3 months and I had learned that he didn't ask things he didn't want to know the answer to. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have good legal representation?" "Yes," I said. "Do you have the documentation? Everything?" He nodded. "Then let the process run." He paused. "Don't let them know you know. That's the only thing that can hurt you right now." I said, "I know." He looked at me for a moment. "You're steadier than most people would be." I said, "I've had practice." He didn't ask what I meant. I think he understood. The thing about waiting for a federal investigation to proceed is that it takes a long time. Months. There were weeks when I heard nothing from Mr. Adesanya at all, and I would be doing something completely ordinary, rescheduling a property management call or taking Dr. Nunn. Hargrove's prescription renewals to the pharmacy, and the anger would rise up so fast it surprised me. Not the hot, loud kind of anger, the cold kind, the kind that sits behind your sternum and waits. Dara called me twice during those months. Once to tell me she was really loving Arizona, and once to ask if I had found any of Owen's old military paperwork, because she thought she might be entitled to some benefits as his sibling. I told her I hadn't found anything. She said, well, keep looking. I said I would. I didn't feel anything when I said it. That was how I knew I was further down the road than I thought. The formal notification from the VA OIG came on a Friday in October. Dara had been identified as having fraudulently claimed survivor benefits using forged documentation. She had submitted paperwork identifying herself as Owen's primary dependent, which required forging my signature on 2 federal forms. The VA was pursuing full recovery of disbursed funds plus interest and penalties. The Department of Justice had been referred for potential criminal charges. Mr. Adesanya called me as soon as he received his copy. He said, "This is about as clear-cut as these cases get." I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you all right?" I thought about it. "I think so," I said. My parents found out 2 days later, when federal investigators contacted Dara. My mother called me screaming, not at Dara, at me. I had gone behind the family's back. I had destroyed Dara's life. I had dragged the family name through something shameful. Didn't I know what this would do to all of them? I let her talk. When she stopped, I said, "She forged my signature on federal forms to steal Owen's survivor benefits while I was grieving him. I did what I was legally and morally required to do." My mother said, "Family doesn't do this to family." I said, "No, it doesn't." And then I hung up. The Hospital Foundation's annual gala was in November. Dr. Hargrove attended every year. This year, he asked me to accompany him, not as a date. He was clear about that, and I respected the clarity. But because he was still managing some fatigue from the stroke, and he wanted someone who knew his medical history nearby, and because, he said, he thought I could use an evening out. I wore a navy dress I had bought with Owen 3 years earlier for a work event that turned out not to matter. It still fit. I did my hair properly for the first time since the funeral. The gala was held at a hotel ballroom in downtown Hartford. Several hundred people, tables with white linens, a string quartet playing something I didn't recognize. Dr. Hargrove moved through the room with the ease of a man who had spent decades being the most competent person in any space, and I moved with him, managing the small logistics. His drink, his medication he'd taken at 7, the 3 people whose names he'd asked me to remind him of if he went blank. I was standing near the edge of the room, giving him space to talk to the foundation's board chair, when I heard someone say my name. I turned. My cousin Felicity was standing there with a glass of white wine and an expression that was trying to be warm and not quite getting there. Felicity was Dara's best friend from childhood, before she was my cousin by marriage, and she had always been precisely as loyal as was convenient. She said, "Lorelei, I didn't know you'd be here." I said, "I'm here with Dr. Morrow, Hargrove." She looked across the room at him, then back at me, recalibrating. "How are you doing with everything?" she said. "Fine," I said. "It's been so hard," she said, and I could hear the performance in it. For everyone. With the investigation and all of that, Dara she's struggling. I looked at her. "She forged my signature," I said, "on federal documents to take money that belonged to me after my husband died." Felicity opened her mouth. I said, "I'm not going to tell you it's complicated because it isn't." She closed her mouth. The program began at 8. There were remarks from the foundation's executive director, a video about the hospital's pediatric oncology expansion, a presentation of the year's major donors. Dr. Hargrove was recognized as a founding benefactor, and he stood and nodded and sat down with the economy of a man who'd been applauded for things many times and didn't need it. Near the end of the program, there was a community service award. The presenter was a county commissioner whose name I recognized from the property tax files. He spoke for 3 minutes about the recipients, a woman who had, he said, volunteered tirelessly with the foundation's veteran outreach program, who had organized fundraising drives and connected veterans to benefits resources, who exemplified the kind of service that made a community stronger. He said the award was going to Dara. I went completely still. Not the Dara. It couldn't be. The name was the same. The connection to veterans' benefits. The volunteering framing. I looked at the program in my hands. There was a small photo. It was her. My sister, who had stolen my dead husband's VA benefits, was being given a community service award for her work in veterans outreach. The commissioner said her name again and gestured toward the audience, expecting her to come to the stage. She wasn't there. She was in Arizona facing a federal fraud investigation. There was a pause, a murmur. The commissioner looked uncertain and said that it appeared the recipient was unable to attend this evening and that the award would be forwarded to her. I felt something shift in my chest. I had not planned what I did next. I want to be honest about that. There was no strategy, no prepared speech. There was only the pause in the room and the empty stage and 14 months of keeping everything in a binder, and the cold anger that had been sitting behind my sternum since October. I stood up. Dr. Hargrove, beside me, looked at me. I walked to the front of the room. The room was quiet now, the particular quiet of people unsure what is happening. The commissioner looked at me with polite confusion. I said quietly to him, "May I say something about this award?" He hesitated. He glanced at the foundation's executive director, who gave the smallest possible nod. He handed me the microphone. I turned to face the room. 300 people with their white wine and their good intentions and their complicated lives. I said, "My name is Lorelei Marsh. I'm the widow of Owen Marsh, who served 8 years in the United States Navy and was honorably discharged. I'm also the sister of tonight's intended recipient." The room was very still. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said. "I'm here because I think the people in this room who care about veterans and their families deserve to have accurate information. My sister is currently under federal investigation by the VA Office of Inspector General for fraudulently claiming my late husband's survivor benefits using forged documents bearing my signature. The investigation is a matter of public record." I paused. "I reported it because it was the right thing to do and because Owen deserved better than to have the only benefit that survived him stolen. I don't expect anyone here to do anything with this information except know it. But I thought you should." I set the microphone down on the podium. I walked back to my seat. Dr. Hargrove said nothing. He picked up his water glass and took a sip. Under the table, he set his hand briefly over mine. Not a gesture of pity, just acknowledgement. And then he removed it. And we sat there while the room resumed breathing around us. The foundation's executive director came to our table during the dessert course. He was a careful, measured man in his 60s who chose his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. He said, "Thank you for telling us. We'll be reviewing our vetting process for awards." I said, "That's all I wanted." He nodded and moved on. On the drive back to Westport, Dr. Hargrove was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That took nerve." I said, "Or poor impulse control. I'm not sure which." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Both can look the same from the outside." We didn't talk much after that. I watched the highway lights pass and thought about Owen, the way I still did every day, not with the acute pain of the first months, but with something quieter. Something that had settled into the shape of my life and was going to be there regardless. The criminal referral to the DOJ proceeded. Dar's attorney negotiated a plea arrangement in the spring. Full repayment of the stolen benefits plus interest, 2 years of probation, mandatory community service with actual oversight this time. No prison, which felt inadequate, but Mr. Adesanya said it was within the normal range for first-time federal fraud cases involving this amount. The money came back to me over 18 months in structured payments. It wasn't enough to undo the 14 months of caregiving leave or the 4 months of VA appeals or the nights I ate cereal for dinner because I was afraid to touch the savings, but it was Owen's, and now it was mine. My parents did not speak to me for 4 months after the DOJ referral. My mother eventually called, not to apologize exactly, but to say that she hoped we could find our way back to each other as a family. I told her I hoped so too, and that it would require her to say out loud that what Dara had done was wrong, and that what I had done was wrong, and that what I had done was right. She said, "It's not always that simple." I said, "Sometimes it is. We're still working on it." I stayed with Dr. Hargrove for another 7 months after the gala. In the spring, his daughter moved back to Connecticut, a divorce, a fresh start, her words, and took over the household management. Dr. Hargrove gave me 3 months severance and a letter of reference that was 3 paragraphs long and said things I didn't know he'd noticed. On my last day, he walked me to my car, slowly, the way he walked everywhere. The rose garden was starting to come in. Pale pink things his wife had planted 20 years ago, and that came back every year without being asked. He said, "What will you do?" I had been thinking about going back to public health. There were federal grants to manage, systems to build, people who needed someone competent and careful and willing to stay on hold for 43 minutes to get the right answer. I told him that. He nodded. "Good," he said. "Don't let them make you small again." I drove out through the gate and turned onto the road toward the highway, and the rose garden disappeared in the rearview mirror, and I turned the radio on, something I hadn't done in a long time. Owen used to say that the hardest part of a Navy wasn't the discipline. It was learning to trust yourself when everyone around you was louder. He said you had to get quiet enough inside to hear what you actually knew. I thought I understood that when he said it. I understand it differently now. I wasn't an admiral. I was never in the military. I was a 31-year-old woman who spent 14 months keeping her husband alive and 4 more months fighting a bureaucracy and several more months working in a quiet house in Connecticut and trying to remember who she was under all of it. But I knew how to run a system. I knew how to read a document. I knew how to stand in a room full of people and say a true thing clearly and then sit back down. That turned out to be enough. I used to think that keeping quiet was a form of grace, that absorbing what was done to you without making noise about it meant you were strong, or at least dignified. I believed that for a long time, through Owen's illness, through the months of insurance calls, through the grief that didn't announce itself dramatically but just sat there, rearranging everything. What I understand now is that there's a difference between choosing silence and being trained into it. My parents trained me into it. Don't make this harder. Don't ask questions. Don't remind us that what you want matters. I followed those rules for most of my life, and then Dara forged my signature onto federal forms and bought herself a condo in Scottsdale with Owen's survivor benefits, and something in me decided the rules weren't serving me anymore. What Dara did had a logic to it in a cold way. She had watched me absorb things my whole life and concluded I would absorb this too. She wasn't wrong about my history. She was wrong about where I was after 14 months of caregiving and 4 months of appeals and everything that followed. She miscalculated what grief does to a person who was already underneath everything very good at keeping records. The cause produced the effect. That's not mystical, it's just true. She chose to steal from someone who happened to document everything, who happened to land in the home of a man who told her to let the process run, who happened to be present in a hotel ballroom in Hartford on the night her name was called for an award she had not earned. Every choice she made created the conditions for what came next. Every choice I made, filing the report, hiring Mr. Adesanya, saying nothing to my family while the investigation ran, also created conditions. I am not separate from the outcome. I build it the way you build anything, one careful step at a time. What I want to say to anyone who recognizes something in this story is that intelligence without action is just suffering. I knew something was wrong before I opened that envelope. I had known for months that the VA timeline wasn't adding up. But knowing isn't enough. The thing that changed everything wasn't grief and it wasn't luck. It was the 43 minutes I stayed on hold. It was the appointment I made with an attorney. It was a binder I had kept because Owen needed me to be the kind of person who kept binders. Every small, unglamorous, competent act accumulated into something that couldn't be ignored. Integrity is slower than theft. Dara moved fast. Forged documents, direct deposit, condo down payment. I moved slowly, correctly, with documentation. Slow one. That's not always how it goes. Sometimes it doesn't. But I think there is something to the idea that doing the right thing at the right pace, without announcing yourself, without performing your own virtue, builds a foundation that is harder to knock over than people expect. The night I stood up in that ballroom, I wasn't brave. I was just someone who had run out of reasons to stay seated. That's what integrity actually looks like most of the time. Not a dramatic moral stand, but a quiet calculation that the cost of silence finally exceeds the cost of speaking. I took the mic. I said a true thing clearly. I sat back down. And I went back to work.